fear is everywhere in the animal kingdom. There's some emotions that only mammals seem to have, like care, for example, for young. Birds do have this as well, but most other reptiles and other vertebrates don't usually have this kind of emotion. Fish, for example, don't care for their young in the same way that dolphins do. But fear is everywhere. All vertebrates and arguably lower life forms have fear. Fear is extremely adaptive. If you don't have fear, you don't live for very long. They've done these interesting experiments on mice where they knock out the fear system, and the mice will just go straight up to a cat and get eaten. So this is kind of a life lesson for all of us. If you don't have fear, you're going to, in fact, encounter all kinds of threats in a way that's very disadvantageous for you and your gene line. There is a human subject named SM, and she's neuroatypical. She had damage to her amygdala, which is the fear processing part of one of the fear processors of the brain. And as a result of that, she feels no fear. Now, they've done a number of experiments with her, psychologists. I can sort of imagine these fun experiments where neuroscientists and psychologists are taking her to haunted houses, and she has no particular fear, terrifying movies, nothing. She feels a kind of state of arousal, like she gets excited when something leaps out and scares her, but she doesn't have fear in the same way. Like she'll go right up to something that most people would run screaming from. So there are cases where human beings lack a fear system, and according to psychologist Abigail Marsh, this is one of the ingredients in psychopathy. If you look at people, obviously psychopaths have been sort of, romanticized and amplified by modern movies, Hannibal Lecter and so forth. But really, psychopathy is much more widespread. It's not, usually so lurid and frightening as one portrays in the films. But it does show that the person lacks a kind of experience of fear. If you ask kids that seem to show psychopathic tendencies, they are afraid of nothing, or they have very minimal fear. And as a result of this, they do not recognize fear in other people. And this is one of the key ingredients. It's not the only ingredient in psychopathy. For example, one of the studies that Abigail Marsh details is that they were interviewing psychopaths in prison, and they asked this guy who had murdered people to look at faces, emotional faces of other human beings. And so they show him a terrified face, and he says, well, I don't know what emotion that is. They ask him to identify what emotion that person is feeling. He says, I don't really know. I've seen that face before, though. That's the face people make right before I stab them to death. So that's a haunting and frightening anecdote for which there is some good statistical corroboration, that a lack of experience with fear and an inability to empathize with someone who is feeling fear or pain is one of the crucial ingredients in psychopathy. So today in our Monsterology, we're going to do something a little different than usual. We're going to actually sort of tour the question of what is fear. And instead of taking on a particular monster like we usually do, let's give ourselves a little bit of a better understanding of the nature of fear. So here's the drawing that we're going to be working on today. I'm fairly pleased with how this turned out. It's a nightmare scene. I decided to draw a woman sleeping in a bed, and then these kind of various icons of horror and terror floating above her. There is a lot of evidence that people dream much more negatively than they do positively. In other words, we have more nightmares than we have positive dreams, which seems to be universally the case. I'm working on a paper here that's called vellum, and I suppose you could call it a tracing paper in the sense that it's translucent, so I've sort of laid it over a white substrate, but it's extremely smooth and kind of difficult to work with. But here I'm laying in a pencil sketch, and then I'm going to come over it with charcoal. When you do the charcoal over it, the charcoal tends to just sort of sit on the top of it until you spray it with a fixative at the end. So it's a little daunting. It feels like while you're drawing it, it's like you're working on a Tibetan sand mandala, and if you sneeze, you're going to blow your entire drawing off the paper. But once you get used to that jeopardy, it's pretty fun to draw on. And so I'm just adding in creatures that seem to be universally terrifying. We've got John Wayne Gacy here as Pogo, the clown. We've got the Medusa by Caravaggio. Spiders appear to be a very common phobia among people. There's only a handful of things that people are universally afraid of. The dark, spiders, snakes, heights, and I think murky water. In any case, let's talk a little bit about what fear is, and maybe the place to start is just to talk a little bit about what fear does to the body. It has a fairly predictable signature in terms of its effects on the body. When you're afraid of something, you see a barking dog coming at you, or you see something in the dark emerging. If you're out in the woods, maybe it's you think it's Sasquatch or something. The glutamate really increases in your brain, and this is the main excitatory neurotransmitter. So this really gets the system up and running, and your breathing rate increases, your heart rate increases. The blood vessels in the peripheral areas of the body, like the skin, they constrict, and the blood vessels around the vital organs and the muscles, they dilate, so oxygenated blood flows to those regions, like the muscles and vital organs, and this readies you for a fight or flight situation. You also get goosebumps, or technically what's called piloerection, which is that the muscles are sort of tighten at the base of each of your hairs, and this doesn't do much for us, but the theory is that our ancestors would have been covered with body hair, like other primates are, and this would have puffed us out, puffed the copious body hair out, making us look a lot bigger than we really are, and this could have been a defensive strategy. So the glucose then rises in your blood, calcium, the white blood cells increase when you're afraid, and what sort of happens is the input of sensory perception, say some frightening sight, triggers the amygdala, and the amygdala is extremely important in fear processing. This then triggers the hypothalamus, and in turn the pituitary gland, and this connects the sort of nervous system to the endocrine system, and the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland then secrete hormones. So the pituitary gland secretes ACTH and CRF, and the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidneys, this secretes epinephrine or adrenaline and cortisol. And then the cortisol then communicates back to the hypothalamus, and it tells the organism, it tells you, it's a fight or flight situation. What happens is that whole sort of circuit is then communicated to the motor system via the para-aqueductal gray, or the PAG part of the brain. And so now your system is basically set to survive. Then the hippocampus, which is where memory is sort of processed, it stores these experiences. So in the future, you know what to be afraid of. Just back to the drawing for a moment here, what I did is I ground up a charcoal pencil into this dust, and I'm basically using a charcoal dust now to sort of paint on to the vellum surface. Here I'm using a blending stump, and the effect is really cool. It is hard to control, like I said, but if you can do it right, it's really worth it. Anyway, once your memory starts storing this stuff, it gets your whole system sort of tuned to what is fearful and what is dangerous in the environment. Spiders and snakes, for example, were very dangerous to our ancestors. Eventually you get social and cultural learning. We're not just hardwired for phobias, we're very good at conditioned learning like other mammals. So eventually then when we get language, we have storytelling and imagery and even religion. And these sort of cultural structures help us to sort of manage fear and tell us what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of. And in part, horror and storytelling like this is a kind of threat rehearsal. We're rehearsing for threats, and also, alternatively, we're distracting ourselves from fear. So that's basically the kind of sort of quick sketch of how fear works in the brain and in the body and even in culture. There's a wonderful theory. It's controversial. It's called terror management theory. And in terror management theory, the argument is that all human beings sort of vaguely understand that they're going to die. And sort of in the back of their brains, they're always worried about this existential threat. And most of culture, from this point of view, is designed to distract us and help us manage this fear or this terror about our own death. So the argument of terror management theory is that religion and art, movies, novels, these are all ways in which we can manage and, in a sense, mitigate and ameliorate these, difficult fears that could be debilitating. One last question of interest is how much fear is innate and how much fear is learned. And there do seem to be hardwired phobias, but also I think human beings, as I said before, can be conditioned through experience and through culture to fear all kinds of things that we would have never encountered in our evolutionary history. For example, we can be afraid of chainsaws, and eventually we can even have a horror tradition about Texas chainsaw massacres and so forth. So we're an extremely flexible learning system. All right, that's, I think, a pretty good sketch of fear, and I hope you enjoyed this drawing of nightmares, and we'll see you next time on Monsterology. Take care.